Shikoku earthquake was a surprise. And the resulting triple disaster probably messed up all our imaginations and predictions. But the stage is set for another incredible disaster, which is an urban earthquake with a direct hit on a large and poorly constructed city. And the threat has increased. Not because there are more earthquakes, no, because humankind has created in the last decades fast-growing megacities. And they are located all over the world, with an unexpected preference to plate boundaries. As we're living in the age of construction on our planet, earthquakes that did not have very much impact before will in the future shake urban agglomerations with millions of people. And many of these settlements don't have earthquake resistance. They are rubble in the waiting. And there is for many no plan and no hope to fix them before their collapse. Roger Bilham calls these cities a neglected weapon of mass destruction. And he adds, an epicentral hit on such a megacity has the potential to kill 1 million people. This is incredible. Not talking about all the second-order risks, like tsunamis or social collapse or destruction of sensible infrastructures. And one candidate for such an urban earthquake is Istanbul, maybe on top of the list. Despite its presence and beauty of the built landscape, the city is located on one of the most seismic active plate boundaries of the planet, the NAF, the North Anatolian Fault System, which is virtually ready to rupture and shake the city. But what do we really know about the future we face? Accurate prediction is a cornerstone of scientific knowledge. But earthquakes cannot be predicted in a deterministic way. In spite of this evidence, they are forecasted on long term, and seismic risk is assessed. But what is seismic risk? Well, that was also a main question of the L'Aquila earthquake trial. Maybe you heard about it. In the wake of the earthquake in 2009, 7 scientists, among well-known seismologists, were convicted for multiple manslaughter and 6 years in prison each. Why? For the criminal act of not having communicated properly the seismic risk for L'Aquila region at that time. Well, the conviction was overturned last November, but still the questions remain. What are the responsibilities for scientists, citizens, and politics? How to communicate scientific outcomes of seismic risk to public and decision makers as well, and how to take decisions upon them. Well, these are questions my project will address and discuss. For example, what is seismic risk and what is risk? Well, risk is a very complex and paradoxical concept with no final definition. It can be said that risk is not real. It's not the disaster. It is the anticipation and imagination of the future possible disaster. And therefore, risk exists only in a permanent state of possibility and virtuality. And in the scientific language of risk, the future possible disaster is anticipated in a certain way. It is quantified and calculated in terms of probabilities by calculus and statistics. And for seismic risk, these probabilities are very low, but the consequences are very high. And seismic risk is mainly, it's a simplification, is mainly the calculation of 2 future performances, which is the ground motion acceleration, which is the earthquake hazard, and the building response to it, the performance of the buildings. And these calculations are really complex stuff and sophisticated stuff. Now, in these omnidirectional videos you see over here, with 4 cameras, they are used from the German Research Center of Geoscience, for example, to survey the building's vulnerability to collapse and damage in Istanbul. Now, I will show you now a video where you can see, I think, pretty good how these 2 dynamics and performances are interfacing in the simulation of the shake tables. So I think you can see here pretty good that the disaster is not only assigned to an external natural agent, the earthquake, but to human decisions. Humans are constructing buildings, and the way they are constructed depends on knowledge or ignorance, building codes and inspections, the economic situation, and the builder's integrity. Corruption is a very big problem. It is the biggest, the highest in the building industry in the world. And this poses also this very old and highly explosive question of the responsibility for earthquake disasters. That's the second paradox. Seismic risk is mainly produced by humans themselves. It's the buildings that kill. And the third paradox, risk starts where certain knowledge ends, which means uncertainty is always on the other side of every scientific knowledge about the future, and even more. Earthquake science is facing different levels and characteristics of uncertainty. Unlike in a casino where you have known probabilities, otherwise nobody would go and play their money, in the physical world, the probabilities assessed, the models, the parameters, and the consequences remain uncertain, imprecise, or cannot be calculated or quantified at all. Some of these uncertainties scientists believe can be reduced with more research and data, which is called the epistemic uncertainty. And if there's a lack of data, which happens pretty often because there are not so many large earthquakes and a decision has to be taken, then the so-called subjective probability judgment is applied. Subjective? Yes, another paradox. In the philosophy of statistics, probability can be divided into either a physical property like mass or distance, or just into a degree of belief. And Professor Randall from the University of California will now give a short introduction to this very interesting scientific approach.
Now, the U.S. Geological Survey, through a fairly Byzantine process, estimates that there's a 62% chance that a large earthquake of magnitude 6.7 will occur somewhere on the faults in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, during the next 30 years. This number is not really very well determined. In fact, the way it's determined is essentially by what is called expert opinion, which means that you get a bunch of people like me in a room, and we all sit around. I didn't participate in this. You get a bunch of people in a room, they all sit around a table, and they vote on what they think the most likely outcomes are. And if you think I'm kidding, I'm not kidding. Okay? That's what they do. Now, they realize that there are problems with this approach, and they'd like to change that. And in fact, these numbers, you might think, well, this is a funny curiosity, but in fact, these numbers are actually used to set the earthquake insurance rates all over California. So it's not clear if these rates have any relation to reality or not.
So you see, earthquake science is in parts very close to science fiction, which is here called intersubjectivity. But earthquake science is operating on the limits of knowledge and the limits of calculation, because the deepest uncertainty involved here, the ontological uncertainty, represents a complete absence of knowledge. It cannot be reduced and it cannot be measured. What might happen in the future is beyond our imagination and experience. It's a surprise. We don't even know what we don't know, which means now everything is possible. Maybe Fukushima was an example for this, or maybe it was only pure ignorance. So can we peer into the darkness and approach the unknowable risk? Ulrich Beck, this famous German risk scientist, said to this: to our knowledge drawn from science and experience, we now must add imagination, suspicion, fiction, and fear to cope with the future. Now, with this challenging outlook, I will come to my project now. I want to install the seismic risk of Istanbul, which means I will install a paradox, the paradox of seismic risk. Create an imagination of the future possible disaster and enable the possibility of a violence to occur by uncertain calculations. How do I want to do this? Let's first have a look at the following scenario. What you see is the collapse of an apartment building in the city of Van by an earthquake. The front has pancaked completely, which means the floor slabs, or called ceilings, fall onto one another, probably no chance to survive. The back has moved into complete instability, only held by the arm of a crane. And to me, this scenario is so scary and uncanny because here the building that should protect has turned into a violent object, acting almost alive and producing a complete disorder. And when you're at home and looking up at your neatly plastered ceilings, it's far beyond your imagination and everyday experience that they could get weaponized. But exactly that happened here. This background of perception, the violent slabs are coming into the front, very dominant and visible. Now, to anticipate and visualize the future disaster, I will now exactly shift this background, the uncanny ruins, into the front and mount them under the ceilings of the venue. Every slab representing a certain building typology for an Istanbul neighborhood. Now, the concrete slabs have not only the aesthetics of a violence, but also the force. 200 or 500 kilos, they really could harm. Now, in order to also add the possibility of a violence to occur by uncertain calculations, I will now connect every slab with the uncertain probabilities of the science for earthquakes and building collapse, with the data and the support of the German Research Center for Geoscience in Potsdam. And now I throw the dice, which means I let the probabilities perform every second or 10 seconds in real time, and they will generate outcomes. And if a building collapse is generated for a slab, then the slab actually really falls down. 200 kilos producing 2 tons of dynamic force. So we have a real proper risk installed. But the probability of a fall down is so low that we probably don't get problems with insurance, as they always rely on calculations. Let's say we have a long-term probability for a major earthquake of 60% in 30 years. This is 2% per year. This is a probability per second of 10 to the minus 8. This seems neglectable, but not over a time span. So this means I have to manage the risk installed in the venue, because a fall down is a real seismic event to the building and the public, you have to get protected. So the project has to evolve into risk reduction, resilience, and decision making, mirroring real conditions. And I would get help here from the Technical University in Berlin and do dynamic experiments with the slabs, for example. Or to make things even more complicated and open, what you see over here, the probabilities performed, are like in a casino. They are known or act as known, they're defined, and the only uncertainty here is the outcome. Well, the task is now to develop a simulation model which also visualizes and maps the deeper uncertainties involved in seismic risk, and recognize the lack of knowledge for uncertain probabilities and those that cannot be quantified. For example, how to account for the uncertainty of corruption and the invisible choices of construction. You cannot survey the whole city in detail, but maybe a sample could visualize this very important correlation between the building's integrity and the integrity of the builder, and scan into the dense structure to pinpoint at weak spots or weak choices. Now, part of the project is also to document, film, and showcase the whole process and all the scientific background information to public and to decision makers. I will now summarize some characteristics of my installation and at once show a 3D model of the installation. Now, the risk here is not produced by a natural environment. It is produced by artifacts connected and animated by human calculations and technologies, with a calculated future and a calculated surprise. And this technical environment maybe represents very good or reflects very good this contemporary condition of risk that is mainly produced by humans themselves and their technologies and calculations, as a result and a basis for our decisions. And maybe it's also a metaphor, a kind of a Damocles sword, not connected to reality, but to the calculations of reality. And emphasizing that construction always comes with responsibility. And of course, it's also a time experiment, interfacing geological time with human time, perceiving low probabilities, deep uncertainties, and all the risk reductions involved. And finally, it's not about the falling here. It is about the possibility of falling. Now, Roger Wilhelm proposes to have a look at the historical record to get a clue of what lies ahead for our future urban world. I will end my presentation now with the animation of the earthquake catalog for Turkey and Greece of the past 15 years. It is an early prototype. It's part of the project, and it's programmed with 4V. The past is the scientific basis for looking and extrapolating into the future. And it might give us now a clue of what lies ahead for Istanbul, a guaranteed very seismic active Turkey.